James Tanis, thank you very much for joining us today. Can we start by just telling us a bit about your role in Bougainville in the last few years?
So thank you, Jonathan. My role has been just basically two major roles that I played during the Bougainville conflict and during the Bougainville peace process. During the conflict, I was part of the Bougainville Revolutionary Army that took up arms against the government of Papua New Guinea, against the mining company. And then during the peace process, I was basically a peace builder. Those were the two main things that my role involved. But let me go back a little bit to 1988. I was just a young student when the conflict started. Because I come from the district where the conflict started, I was unable to go to school. I stayed back in the village. So I stayed all my entire life in the district that I come from, took part in it, and I've never left Bougainville since then. Also to say that I never completed my school, so I'm just basically a village boy from that area who took active participation in the fighting and in the peace building, and I continue to be a peace builder today.
Right. Yeah. And back when you were a student prior to the conflict, you never dreamed you would one day be president?
I never dreamed that one day I will be the president. In fact, I hated politics so much that I decided not to take social sciences in school. I was just majoring in mathematics, science, and strangely I was studying Japanese language. So and in the end I ended up starting to be an accountant, thinking that I would take up a profession where I can spend some quiet time behind the doors, just playing around with figures and balancing the books. So
and what was the sequence of events that led you to become president?
Because I come from the area and I got myself involved in the early days. I was sort of lucky because in the early days of the militancy and the insurgency, there were not many young men that were recruited into the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. But because I come from the district, the Panguna district, where the problem started from, I naturally just entered into the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, and I was one of the few educated ones, just not high level of education, but just enough level of education to at least carry a weapon, but at the same time carry a pen and a paper. That was the main distinction from about me and the other combatants that I was fighting alongside with. Yeah. So what I would say is that because of that background, it gave me an extra leverage to associate myself to the fighting men as a young man, but also listen to the older people, the older leaders under which we were fighting, to listen to them. And because of that education background I had, Francis Honor, the Supreme Commander, got me to work for him. So basically I was doing a bit of fighting here and there, and a bit of attending meetings, listening to the political leaders, writing and taking notes for them. So I grew up and in that environment as a young man, took part in fighting, but at the same time I was beginning to take more political responsibilities. In 1990, the government of Papua New Guinea pulled out, and in the first ceasefire in 1990 left a big vacuum, and Bougainville was thrown into a turmoil. Because of the way the conflict started. The Bougainville Revolutionary Army was not a conventional army. It was almost an army of the villages. So we came from all walks of life. Some were politicians, some were businessmen, some were religious people, some were students like me. And of course, a good number of them were people from the criminal elements. So when the state functions withdrew, the criminal elements started coming up. And they overpowered the political masters, and Bougainville was thrown into a period of chaos and violence and anarchy. And that was a time when a certain part of the population started thinking, okay, this is not safe. Maybe we will be better off with the government of Papua New Guinea. So they started linking and communicating and contacting the Papua New Guinea Defense Force for the return of the Papua New Guinea authorities back on the island. And of course, because of the difference of opinion on the politics, Bougainville was divided, and then one part of Bougainville was still under Bougainville Revolutionary Army, and the other part of the Bougainville under a militia that was sponsored by the government of Papua New Guinea and by the Papua New Guinea government, with weapons given by Australia under the defense, Australian defense Papua New Guinea ties.
Right.
Yes. So Bougainville was then basically divided in half. We continued fighting amongst ourselves, and the conflict was becoming complicated.
Yes.
As I mentioned in the presentation, the Bougainville conflict started developing multiple layers. It started from a frustration against the mining company, and when the state mishandled the situation, the Bougainvilleans retaliated against the state, meaning Papua New Guinea, and when the state withdrew, there was a vacuum, and part of Bougainvilleans retaliated against the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, so Bougainville was also divided.
Right.
So it went into a multiple layer of conflict.
Yes.
And we continued that way. There was a stalemate. We could not move any further. Papua New Guinea government nor the Bougainville side would do any progress forward. But when that was happening, the victims for the civil society, people were suffering.
Yes.
So there had to be a way out. And the way out was first attempted by the government of Papua New Guinea when they hired a mercenary, South African-based mercenaries that was called Executive Outcomes.
Right.
Outcomes that was not very well received by the military in Papua New Guinea. For the government of Papua New Guinea to hire a mercenary company outside of Papua New Guinea was seen as a vote of no confidence against their own state institution.
Sure.
So the Papua New Guinea Defense Force revolted against the government of Papua New Guinea. Bit of problems in Mosby. The Prime Minister resigned. But when that was happening, it gave one thing to the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. It gave an immediate sympathy in Papua New Guinea, sympathy on Bougainville, and also sympathy abroad.
Right.
And that brought in a big amount of international attention, and that also sent a powerful message to Bougainvilleans that time has come for us to reunite. And also, as I mentioned in my presentation earlier, was that there was now a thinking in the Bougainville Revolutionary Army leadership that the guerrilla warfare tactics were now failing. We had to move to a higher level.
Right.
Meaning the higher level was now of diplomacy, negotiations, and peace and dialogue and reconciliations.
Right.
And of course, what was clear in our minds was that the weapons we were holding were no longer going to play a major role. Our major weapon would be international credibility and friendship, trust and respect. And they will be more of the important tools that we will be needing for peace building. But during the process that I just mentioned,
Yes.
From a student, I became a fighter. Then from a fighter, I was also playing more of a clerical and administrative roles within the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. And then around 1993, 1993, I resigned from the Bougainville Revolutionary Army and just decided to stay in the village. And then I re-entered the Bougainville Revolutionary Army with a very totally different function that I thought I would never do also. That was to work with the chiefs in the village and take more active responsibilities in political awareness and political education.
Right.
What we noticed then was that, look, to us, what is independence? We call this word independence, and not many people knew what independence was. So what we did was we formed a small group, a discussion group where we would sit down, criticize ourselves, criticize our leaders, and just to think if we are on the right track.
Right.
But out of that discussion group, what we came up with is a political education program that started giving out a basic political awareness on what independence is and what state building is, what peace is, and what we can do and what we cannot do. And of course, an important part of it was to recognize our own limitation. Our own limitation was, the first one, we were aware that the international community, there was no third nation sponsoring Bougainville independence and sponsoring the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. We were alone on an isolated island.
Right.
So we had to think. And second, the international community continued changing. And if we continue to drag on, we will lose support. And of course, our people were changing. In the end, we will lose people. And also, most of our commanders were getting killed. And also, as I mentioned in my presentation earlier, two things that characterize Bougainville warfare is the ability to start it and the ability to end it.
Right.
And traditionally, even from the days of our grandfathers, if you start a war, you must make sure you end it within your time, so that you do not lose the objectives of the conflict. Anyway, so we formed that group. I designed a small political education program. We conducted it in the villages with the fighting men, with the chiefs. And quickly, slowly, it got recognition from the leaders of the struggle. So I was asked then to join the political leadership.
Right.
And then I was appointed the Minister for Peace, even I think 2 years before the start of the formal peace process.
Right.
So what it gave us was that even in the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, even during the days of fighting, there was already a small core unit in the Bougainville Revolutionary Army that was thinking peace, and that was thinking peace, discussing peace, so that we already had a grassroots initiative going. In fact, some of the reconciliations that we had actually started before the signing of the formal peace process.
Right.
With the other Bougainville factions, and also with the government of Papua New Guinea, and of course long before the arrival of the neutral peace monitoring groups and the United Nations observer mission.
Right.
So the most important thing maybe that I would leave in this seminar is to say that peace can be advocated, peace can be attempted to be enforced, but peace really starts with those who hold on. Peace actually will hold on until those who are in the center of the fighting decide to accept peace.
Right.
Yes, a lot of few Bougainvillean leaders lost their lives. Few civilians lost their lives in their attempts for peace. So, but the difference with this peace process at the moment, the current peace process, is that the peace process now is held on because it is based on a decision that was made by the Bougainville Revolutionary Army.
Right.
So it's not that because we have a magic formula or that. It's simply because of the fact that we were the ones that were doing the fighting, and we were the ones we had to accept peace and lead peace.
You mentioned that at the height of the conflict there were sort of multiple layers. I guess you reach a point where some of the objectives start to get a bit lost.
Yeah, the objectives started getting lost right after 1990.
Right.
Because the main two objectives were based on the grievance against the mining company, and then from that it evolved into a long-standing issue over the question of Bougainville independence away from Papua New Guinea.
Right.
But then it was getting lost into just pure hatred, and also certain groups were abusing that vacuum, the situation to score their own, to settle their own scores.
Yes.
So there was some personalized conflicts.
Right.
So we were beginning to lose it, and I must say that we are actually lucky that we had to end the conflict before the two original agendas were lost.
And so just summarising one of your points there, the turning point really came when the focus went from conflict to dialogue about what everyone wanted to achieve.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, the turning point came when those of us who were in the center of the fighting realized that fighting would not achieve anything.
Right.
We had to move on. We had to adapt.
Right. So tell me about your involvement in the peacekeeping process now. What drives you to continue after so many years of, I guess, living with conflict and having been involved in the process of resolving that?
I'll go back to the time when I was the Minister for Peace. Within the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, I started working as a Minister for Peace when the peace monitoring group started coming in. Naturally, I was the main person within the Bougainville Revolutionary Army that started linking and started connecting at a grassroots level to now change into the new situation.
Yes.
But before that, because we were in a blockade situation, we could not get much information from the outside. And one day, while in the bush, we got a book. The book was written by Nelson Mandela, long walk to freedom.
Right.
And one of the important statements he made was, you cannot make peace by talking to your friends, but you have to make peace by talking to your enemies.
Right.
And during the presentation, I mentioned that we had a difficult time trying to adjust to the Australian participation because of the colonial history and the mining history we
Yes.
had. To us, Australia was the enemy. But we had to find a way out. Yes. We tried our best to find another nation to support the peace process,
Yes.
but we could not find any nation that could beat the Australian contribution. Australia was contributing big money, big time in terms of finance, human resource, and also logistics.
Yes.
So we had to find a way out. And the way out for us was to put a United Nations observer mission, so that those who still continue to have problems with Australian participation, at least will link through the United Nations.
Yes.
But there's something else that I will mention in this interview that I did not mention at the seminar.
Sure.
One of the things that we found it a little bit difficult with the peace monitoring group was the humanitarian aspect of it.
Right.
The way the peace monitoring group was deployed on Bougainville, their mandate was not humanitarian assistance. Their mandate was monitoring the peace, and that's it. But there were times when we would end up in a situation we would have wanted a bit more from them in terms of assistance.
Yes.
But we could not ask them anything more than that.
Right.
And in a Bougainville society, what we believe in is this: sharing is caring, caring is respect, and respect strengthens peace. And I'll give you two examples. There was an Australian peace monitoring site, and this site was I think it was a center that was most closest to Panguna. And the standing order at the camp, or their policy was, if there's food, this leftover, bury it, don't give it to the locals. So one day they had a big leftover of meat. So under their regulations, they could have buried it. But one of the commanders the commander was assigned to that camp, decided, no, we are going to waste this. We give it to the locals.
Right.
So he gave the meat to us. We distributed the meat, but some of the meat from the peace monitoring group, we ended it out to the ones that were still resisting the peace process, holed up in the mountains.
Right.
They received that meat, they distributed that meat amongst themselves, and a week later, a line of commanders came down and asked me if they could talk to the peace monitoring group, and that's how they joined the peace process. Yes, so that is one example of a situation where I noticed that maybe if there was a humanitarian side attached to this peace operation,
Right.
it would help. Because remember, I talked about the multiple layers. The deployment of the Australian forces on Bougainville in the peace monitoring group was actually, in my view, was supposed to have provided two functions.
Yes.
One is to facilitate a neutral environment for us, the Bougainville factions,
Yes.
and also a relationship building between the Bougainvillians and the Australians.
Right.
But let me say that even though the humanitarian side of the peace mission was not their mandate, they did very well. So this peace operation on Bougainville also helped to improve relationships with the Australians on Bougainville. In
Right.
fact, it was only about 3 months ago. I did one major peace activity. In Bougainville, there was the location around Panguna was a no-go zone to the Australians during the peace operation.
Right.
In fact, no peace monitor entered Panguna during that time. It was only about 3 months ago when I for the first time arranged a reconciliation between the Australian High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea, Ian Kemis,
Right.
and the faction that refused to talk to the Australians. And this ceremony involved a very simple thing, not big money, just one live pig with a bag of rice and we perform a cultural ritual to allow the Australian High Commissioner for the first time after 23 years for any Australian official to enter into Panguna. So what I'm trying to get at, Jonathan, is this. Peace building on Bougainville is largely based on relationship building.
Yes.
Relationship building, because through relationship building, you then improve perspectives, and then you improve perceptions. If there's a negative perception, then you improve it through relationship.
Yes.
And in a Melanesian society like Bougainville, the way we build a relationship is not in formal meetings. It might take you just an offer of a cigarette. Offer a cigarette lighter to a stranger, you've made one friend. Offer food, you make a friend. In fact, there were times, Jonathan, when I wondered what could have happened if the policies and the regulations allowed the Australian Army commanders and the civilian monitors to chew betel nut.
Right.
Because we use betel nut in peace building.
Yes.
We use betel nut in gatherings and to make friendships. And we use betel nut to court women too.
Right.
So
I'm not sure how well that would work in Australia, but you made a very.
I know it's a difficult thing. They would not allow it, but
No.
I'm just trying to
But the
make
point
a
you're
point.
making is that understanding local customs, local traditions, understanding local people and the way they communicate is a really important part of the peace process, because if you can't build the relationships, then you can't have dialogue.
I'll give you another example. The Fijians, the regulations did not allow Fijians and Nevans to bring in kava, but
Right.
few of them sneaked in. And the kava plant, the Yangona plant where kava is made from, actually grows wild on Bougainville, too much of them. It's just that we Bougainvilleans, we don't use it.
Right.
So they did use some, sneaked in some, used that opportunity to build relationships. So,
Right.
because the official mandate of the peace monitoring group did not have a humanitarian assistance where sharing can be part of the program, few people broke rules to build relationships, and it worked for the peace process.
And it sounds like it's a lesson learned for the future in similar situations.
Yes,
James Tanis, thank you very much for your time today.
my pleasure.